We are so far behind. I'm Ron Burke, Editor-in-Chief for GamingTrend.com, and as you can see, it is time once again to return to our Iron Man Mark III build from Fanhome. I'm finally recovered from my surgery and I can reliably make it up the stairs, as sad as that is to say. But now I can reach my studio, we can start getting to work. Now the last one was up to episode number 54, so now we're going to start working on 55 through 58. Without further ado, let's do some power of editing and get to work. I went ahead and raised the table a little bit so you can start to see the landscape here. I'm going to switch to my second camera. We do have quite a few parts that are already kind of assembled, and the parts that we're going to be working with today are these four. 1, 2, 3, 4, and also another portion of the stand. I'm going to go ahead and set that aside because we'll get to that later. Then we also have the 4 comic books here. Go ahead and drag these out. We have these 4 comics. Looks like Ultra Modern Armors, Dark Angel, Hulkbuster 4, Endosim Armor, and then looks like the Premium Base continuation assembly guide there. So we're going to pack these up, set them aside, and we're going to focus on episode number 55, which are just these parts, looks like here, and also might just be those parts. Yep, that's this part here, and then I think that's part of the same part. So it's just going to be a very quick assembly with just those pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and set all the rest of the pieces aside, and we'll be right back. Before we get started, I do want to say thank you again for joining me. We have been running this series for quite a while now, and we have had some bumps along the way that have slowed me down, but you guys have stuck with me, and I really appreciate that. That means a great deal to me. I do have a ridiculous stack over here, but I want to assure you that that's not going to make me rush. I want to take my time and go through these in the way that you would expect. So we're going to do it exactly as we always have, starting with the comics. So let's do that. As I said, this one is Ultra Modern Armors. This one opens with more about the Avengers Initiative. A great deal of the Avengers Initiative was not really well covered by the movies. It really was kind of glossed over more to get to the part where you have the conflict between Tony and Captain America, but what we do miss, thanks to that, is some additional characters that just didn't have screen time, and it probably wasn't reasonable to get them screen time in the meantime leading up to it. So we have people like Hardball, Komodo, Thor Girl, Rage, Slapstick, and Ultra Girl. These people are just, who are these people? If you've never seen the comics, there's more than that. There's Yellow Jacket, there's Gauntlet, there's Henry Peter Grinch. There's a ton of people that just simply weren't in the movies, but were part of this larger Avengers Initiative. The only time that I've actually seen this covered, even to a small degree, is in the PlayStation 2 game. The name's escaping me right now, but it's another hero shooter, third-person isometric game, and there were so many heroes. They gave you kind of the main ones, and then you could recruit and discover some of the other ones. I want to say Activision was the publisher, but I might be wrong. It's been a minute, so. But I'm sure somebody's going to tell me in the comments which game that was. It was a blast. There were 2 of them, and it would be awesome to see those come back in the modern age. Just if nothing else, to see some of these crazy characters. To that end, this section really does cover the sort of things that Hank Pym would put these new would-be Avengers through, almost a series of basic trainings, and we have the danger rooms, and we have a lot of just overall training on what it means to be a hero, at least from Hank's perspective, with some dashes of Tony and some dashes of Captain America all thrown in there. So there's a lot of crossover opportunity, including some returning villains that even made their way in, including guys like Taskmaster. So this is an interesting read. It's certainly just crossover heaven if you wanted to see the most unlikely of heroes and villains all coming together in what would ultimately lead to their split, which is the Avengers Initiative. This assembly is really the right thigh. We've obviously done this before. We actually have this sitting over here from a previous installation, and there really is nothing to it. I've almost done it just setting it over here. And that's take this thigh plate, There's some small posts here, and they go in where it is obvious that they go. And voila, look at that. Holy crap, assembled like magic. So we're gonna keep these set aside. Obviously when we finish setting up things like this thigh over here, we're gonna start putting some of these parts together, and this piece is going to join these other pieces to create a complete leg. So moving ahead, you can start to see exactly what it's talking about. This is that rear portion of behind the knee and the right thigh. Next up, love behind the mask. Madame Mask is yet another one of Tony's unfortunate dalliances. He meets this woman, Whitney Frost, who ends up being yet another lover in a long string of them for Tony, and yet another one that's tragically beaten and bruised and scarred mentally over time. So her father ends up being this major villain for Tony, but that's almost a footnote, if you will. Poor Whitney here, she's got this mask that she wears to conceal her identity. She ends up falling in love with Tony, then she ends up fighting Tony, then she ends up falling in love with him again. Her father turns out to be this master villain and named Nefaria, and Tony ends up defeating him, and all throughout this there's this kind of off again, on again fight between Tony and Madame Mask. And this mask is literally just her identity shield in this first part. But this trauma eventually leads to what we have here, which is more the modern version of Madame Mask. And she is certainly damaged. She has a lot of trouble with mental instability. She's had her heart broken by Tony enough times where it's kind of scarred over for her, where, you know, she loves him, but she also hates him, and that causes her to capture Pepper and torture her. Ultimately, she's this damaged individual, and Tony ends up having to confront her, where she takes off the mask, and it turns out that all of this has led to her being fairly awful on the outside as well. Her face is now scarred, and this mask is not only protecting her identity, but also shielding her from the world and preventing, you know, anyone from seeing her true face. So kind of a tragic figure in Tony's life, and another one that, you know, ultimately scars Tony's life as well. As we've mentioned in previous installations of this series, Tony became a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know if it's just the willingness to say, okay, let's throw sanity to the wind and make Tony's backstory even as convoluted as the rest of the Guardians of the Galaxy, but allow me to just simply read the top portion of this. Kidnapped and trapped inside the God Killer, a vast and ancient weapon, Tony Stark learned that he hadn't just been raised by his parents, but also by Recorder 451, a member of an alien race, the Regalians, who see Tony as a potential pilot for the God Killer. Okay, so obviously we've left sanity behind, but what we get into here, more importantly, is more modularity of Tony's suits. And we see some of this variety here, just kind of some experimentation of this, how can I have more than one suit active at the same time? We've seen this come up multiple times throughout all of Tony's stories. This just happens to occur during the Guardians of the Galaxy phase, and this kind of offshoot with the God Killer armor that ultimately traps him inside, which is, again, hardly the first time Tony's been trapped in one of his suits. It's almost, that's just almost a Tuesday at this point. So, setting that one aside, we're going to move on to our next assembly, which is going to be, looks like a little bit more of the thigh armor, which we obviously have assembled here in the past, and also to talk about Dark Angel. This next installation is going to be a little bit fun because we're definitely diving into the next phase for the Marvel MCU and some spoiler territory. So brace yourself, I'm going to try and be as spoiler free as I can. It's a lot of speculation, of course, but we're definitely going to be digging into where I think Marvel movies are headed next. So 56 opens with Rhodey. So we're dealing with a post-Iron Man Rhodey. So this is where Tony has basically died once again. He seems to die a lot, but This feels like this might be where the MCU is headed, where he's permanently dead. And War Machine is called in to fight against a completely new threat that we're starting to see with some of the Disney Plus shows, the Skrulls. So the problem with the Skrulls is, of course, that anybody can be a Skrull. So you can't really trust anyone in your environment that they're not the enemy. So they bring in Rhodey and another person that they call the Cybermancer, that between her and Rhodey, they're able to take on the Skrull using some of the arms and equipment that Tony had left behind, including some of these massive armors like the satellite armor here. War Machine literally comes from Tony's belief that he could put the entirety of an army inside this one suit that Rhodey wears. So this is really the start of James Rhodes taking on the role of Protector for Earth. I do have to ask one question though. Thrakachum. So do you imagine that they actually sit in a room at Marvel HQ and they kind of pull these out of a hat and say, all right, so I want like a two-part explosion. Kaboom's not getting it done. What's gonna get it done? Do you think they actually workshop Thrakachum before they arrive at something so ridiculous? Who knows, but that's the fun of Marvel, right? Moving on, let's do some assembly. We're once again in familiar territory. We're grabbing this front thigh plate, this outer thigh plate, and this other outer thigh plate. And we're grabbing this from episode 56, that's our previous one. This is our assembled leg piece, or I'm sorry, 53. This is our assembled piece from episode 53 for the outer thigh plate. And again, we're not talking like crazy assembly here. We're lining up these two little nubs here, and we're simply putting it where said nubs go and pressing it in place. Voila, like magic, completely assembled. And we'll be adding these two pieces during a future installation. So once again, as so it goes with this large pile of stuff that we're accumulating, we'll be setting these aside. This next section represents well, frankly, a failed portion of crossovers that occurred during the 1980s. Starting off with what's called the Strike Force. So Strike Force covers some of the New Mutants era, it covers crossovers with the X-Men, it covers crossovers with Mandarin, and it also has kind of a side jaunt, if you will, where Tony Stark was a sleeper agent for Kang the Conqueror. Now, obviously, we're starting to deal with Kang the Conqueror in the next version of the MCU, so who knows what they're gonna do. I doubt it's this, though. It wasn't very successful and wasn't very popular, but basically, Tony Stark was a sleeper agent for Kang the Conqueror, and ultimately, when he was activated or woken up, he ended up going on this crazy killing spree and murdering a bunch of people. Not exactly popular with folks who are big fans of Iron Man, being this kind of I don't know, damaged savior, if you will, to turn out to be this horrible sleeper agent. So this particular comic didn't run for very long, but it does have a very violent history. Ultimately, he ends up killing the supreme intelligence of the Kree. You know, there's just this kind of wanton slaughter, if you will. And in the end, Tony sacrifices himself. I don't know if that's the writer seeing the writing on the wall, if you will, that this is just not going to be a very popular series for them. But ultimately, you know, Tony expresses his regret, and all this kind of gets reset. So don't know that it actually matters that much to the overall canon of Tony Stark, but it is kind of an interesting side jaunt of, I don't know, tying back to even the Iron Man song from Black Sabbath, you know, kills the people he once saved. So if you want a dash of that, that's the, what is it, Forceworks and Strike Force comics series. You can pick that up for yourself and check it out. It's definitely an interesting one, and there's also a bit of a crossover with the X-Force side of things. So that's this particular comic, and then we move on to Dark Angel. So this last section is really interesting, and I'm just going to read this first paragraph because I think it sets up everything perfectly and lets you know just how interconnected, whether they're popular or not, all of these different MCU elements are. Tony Stark has received various emotional blows. His friend Maya Hansen, so we're talking Iron Man 3, has been killed by AIM. He has discovered that he's actually adopted, and he has a secret brother, Arno, who's his parents' biological son. Okay, so we kind of eliminated that. That's not a thing in the MCU. And now he's embroiled in his most ruthless confrontation with the Mandarin, and when the villain's 10 rings, who have declared war on Tony Stark, seek new hosts for their mission. For its new host, the spectral ring has chosen Malekith, the dark elf and current ruler of the realm of Svartalheim. So we've got Thor crossover, we've got Iron Man 3 crossover, we've got the proper Mandarin and the 10 rings, which are the 10 bracelets now apparently. But we're dealing with a lot of different crossovers. Again, it doesn't matter if they were popular. This is just showing you how interconnected all of these different things can be. So in this particular armor, he's fighting the Dark Elves, so he needs something that's a little bit more one-on-one. They're definitely a race that can tangle with Tony up close, so he builds this kind of armor on armor. And it's this rusted iron armor that he can put on top of an existing Iron Man suit. So he gets all of his capabilities of things like repulsor beams and the ability to fly and his unibeam from his chest. So he has all of those capabilities, but he also has this iron suit that's on top that is toxic and ultimately lethal to the Dark Elves. So he can tangle with them directly, and if they even so much as touch him, they're going to be damaged by his armor. So this armor on armor allows him to defeat the Dark Elves. It's an interesting kind of almost medieval look for Tony Stark. You can see these kind of wrist blades. It's very much a mixture of like a medieval suit of plate with something almost Predator-like, or even Wolverine-like. Plus a dash of War Machine on top of it. So it's an interesting amalgamation that Tony ends up using, of course, just for one specific thing, as he is wont to do. That ends this particular one, and we're going to next take a look at an evolution of the Hulkbuster, the Hulkbuster 4. Episode 57 deals with some of Tony's demons. I know we pretty much cover that in almost every episode, but this one is some specific ones. Tony Stark doesn't really have nightmares, but he has 5 in specific that are covered in this particular series, and I'm going to go ahead and read those out. Tony Stark Tony Stark himself refers to the 5 nightmares, which are: the one day he won't be strong, and his alcoholism will overwhelm him again, that technological progress will render the Iron Man armor easy and cheap to replicate, that someone other than him or his friend James Rhodey Rhodes will pilot his armored suit, that the armor, the very concept of Iron Man, will become disposable and banal. In my heart, I know it's because without Iron Man, I wouldn't know what to do with myself, he reveals. And finally, and trying together several of the above, that he himself could be the one who might render the Iron Man armor cheap and disposable. So those 5 nightmares are what keeps Tony awake at night. And ultimately, he ends up having to deal with all of them rather simultaneously as he tangles with Ezekiel Stane. So this is Obadiah Stane's son that you might recall from a previous install on this series, that Tony met him when he was a young kid. Well, now he is a bit older and is unhappy with Tony's explanation that Obadiah killed himself, which we know to not be true anyway. But he's not willing to accept that, and naturally he takes control of Obadiah and Tony's technologies and ends up building his own armors. And in this, he creates a group of suicide bombers and I don't want to say just bombers, but people that can use technology to hurt other people. We see a bit of this in Iron Man 3 sort of thing, where we've got people that are willing to kind of sacrifice themselves for what they perceive as the greater good, and Ezekiel Stane has convinced these people to do exactly that, and they take out some groups, a Filipino supergroup known as the Triumph Division, and now they're hurting innocent people, including Pepper Potts. So pretty much in this series, all 5 of these nightmares come to pass, and Tony, knowing that these suicide bombers are going to have a devastating effect on the people of Long Island, people of Valencia, California, Tokyo, etc., and he has to stop them. So he uses a EMP to stop these suicide bombers, but in doing so, he realizes that he now has another nightmare. He has to realize the kind of man that he has to become to stop these people that want to do horrible things, because in using this EMP, he's actually killing all of these suicide bombers, because the technology that they were going to use to hurt other people was also keeping them alive. So he's now punished them with a death sentence, regardless of whether they pulled off their suicide attack or not. So this is going to weigh heavily on Tony, and now he has created a nightmare for himself. Yeah, sure, he ultimately scraps with Ezekiel Stane one-on-one. They have this fight, and he ends up defeating him, of course, but that's almost a footnote compared to the other things that Tony has to deal with in fighting Stane and becoming the kind of person that's willing to kill a bunch of people to prevent the deaths of other people. Moving on, we have the assembly of the right thigh. I've gone ahead and pulled aside the parts that we're going to need, including this, which we'll need for the next section, and we're talking a handful of screws for this assembly. We've done this before, so let's go ahead and get to it. So we'll flip this inner thigh over, and this, I believe it's a knee cover, and it's really simple. This assembly portion is merely lining up these screw holes and dropping in a screw from the other side. So these kind of snap into place, nice and easy. And then I'll grab my screwdriver. I don't need all three of them. And pop in the screw on both sides. Gentle reminder, metal screw joining two plastic pieces. You don't need a ton of pressure, and you certainly don't need to torque these down very much. They'll stay put, but if you do over tighten them, they won't stay put. So, gentle, get them nice and snug, don't over tighten. Nice and easy. Next section, I always like to place these the same way that they have them. We're taking this little cap. It has a post. Post goes in there. You can see that there's kind of a cutout here. I did just notice that this says R1. And this one says R2. So make sure you grab the correct one. R1. Place the shallow piece here and just snap it in place. Just like that. And then you might recall from just a moment ago, final assemble issue number 53 we put on this piece. You guessed it, we're taking R2 and we're going to do the same exact thing. We're a little closer. So these pieces are ultimately going to join together around a leg piece. So those will join together and it'll look awesome. But for now, we've just assembled the two pieces. I'm going to go ahead and police up this screw and set it aside, and then we will move on to Evil Stark. So recently, Disney has been running a show called What If? And in it, if you've not seen it, it's basically alternate versions of different things that could happen in alternate universes in the Marvel MCU. So in this one, it's really just the team playing around. You know, you write thousands of these Iron Man comics, maybe you want to blow off a little steam. So in this What If episode for Iron Man, we have what if Yinsen didn't quite get Tony charged up in the cave where he became Iron Man, and all of that armor ended up going to the enemy. And that's exactly what happens in this comic. Yinsen fails, Tony fails, and the warlord Wong Chu takes the armor for himself, implants a device in Tony's chest that basically holds him hostage because it can kill him remotely. Seems like that's always happening to poor Tony. But in this, he takes the armor and, of course, does horrible things on Wong Chu's direct orders, and it says evil Tony Stark, but I mean, at least in this one, he's not really evil, he's just being controlled. Then we're going to jump over to yet another kind of bizarro land, Tony Stark, and that's Tony Stark in 1602. So Tony Stark is now a Spanish nobleman during the war against England. So we have some familiar faces like Dr. David Banner and that kind of thing. So now we have basically medieval Tony Stark. Then we jump to Iron Man the villain, which is almost a lizard-like type creature. And this is in the Marvel 616 universe. So, or another world of twisted realities is the Cancerverse. So, just all sorts of bizarro world versions of Tony, including Iron Man the Emperor. So this is just take the lever and pull it all the way to the right. This is Tony being his most evil, certainly not the Tony Stark that we've known and loved. It's literally Tony taking over the entire world and still not being satisfied. So you've got some fun comics here. I see it as the writers just needing to blow off steam. I mean, you write so many good guy Tony Stark themed comics. Eventually, you want to take a break and do something different. So after that, let's take a look at the Hulkbuster. So Tony's best friend is Bruce Banner, but it hasn't always been that way. And there have certainly been some moments where Bruce's desires were trumped by the man inside the Incredible Hulk. So Tony, as a contingency plan, usually contingency plans on top of contingency plans, has built the Hulkbuster now 4 times. And there's one common theme: it's never enough. So in this episode, we see the 4th iteration of the Hulkbuster. And Tony is once again trying to make sure that he can stop the Hulk should he get out of control. This time he's trying an even bulkier armor based off the heavy armor from last time, and now sonic weapons. And as you might expect, it doesn't work. So in this episode, we actually discovered that Tony had attempted to get Bruce to look at the gamma bomb that ultimately changed his life, but he was so drunk that he barely even remembers it. And this obviously pisses off Banner and ultimately the Hulk, and they square off. Armor's fairly destroyed, and in the process we discover that Tony had actually sent an email warning Bruce about the potential of a safety issue with the bomb that changed his life, and just happened to be in this drunken stupor that it didn't end up making its way there in a timely fashion. It was in his inbox, but Bruce is already pissed off at him, so he didn't read it. And obviously, if he had, we wouldn't have the Incredible Hulk. So, there you go. That does it for this one. Our last episode for this particular assembly is the Endosim Armor, episode number 58, where we're going to build a shin, and hopefully, we're getting closer to actually having a leg. So let's crack it open. So I'm going to do something a little bit different this time. I'm actually not going to cover this particular section. When I read it and I realized what it covered, there's no way this doesn't get integrated into the next movies. It's already integrated into some of the shows on Disney Plus, including the new Secret War stuff that Nick Fury is going through. So there's no way I can cover this without a great deal of spoilers. It does cover all the Secret Invasion, Skrull Attack stuff, so I just can't do it. So we're going to actually skip past it and move directly to the assembly portion. Next up, we're going to be assembling the shin, which we've done before. It's actually this shin piece right here. We're actually assembling this part, this hinge that goes over the boot. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. Let's set this aside. Sorry about the plank. What we're going to be doing is flipping this over and getting this small little hinge plate in place so it can rock this back and forth like I just showed you just a moment ago. Pretty simple, nothing too complicated here. Just need to put a screw into the right spot and lay this particular thing inside like so. And then drop this little cover on top so it can actually move and actuate. little easier said than done. I guess I'll show you on the second page so you can see what I'm about to do. See, we're placing this little hinge piece directly over the top of it. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that inside. It's impossible to mess it up, which is the good news. They've been really good about that. You can't accidentally mess this up, but if you look close, there's like a small U-shaped portion here. That's going to be the kind of drawer in which this rests. So you're going to lay that in place, and you'll know when it's in the right place because it does kind of notch in there. And then simply put a screw over it and lock it down. And if you've done it correctly, this actuates, which it does. So that'll let the boot move when we get this all assembled, which it seems like we're getting really close. I mean, we're going to be putting this knee portion in here soon and putting all of these pieces that we just did all in here. So it looks like we're going to have a second leg assembled very shortly. This is exciting stuff because it's pretty quickly we're going to have the lower half of this entire Mark IV done, and I'm just jazzed for that. So let's move on to Hawkeye. The everyday hero that nobody particularly likes. So everybody gives Hawkeye grief, and it really comes down to just one thing. You've got all these superheroes with all these incredible powers, and Hawkeye has none of it. He's just a dude with a bow. So in that way, it's hard to root for him. You know, he doesn't have the ability to fly. He can't, fire beams from his hands. He's just a dude with a lot of tricks and an excellent shot with a bow. So that makes it very hard to latch on to him as a hero, and we see a little bit of that in the movies and also in the comics. Ultimately, Tony and Hawkeye end up being kind of friends, but it's this weird rivalry thing, insofar that Tony even ends up telling him, hey, why don't you go out and create your own supergroup on the West Coast called the West Coast Avengers, or Wackos as they're commonly called. And that group ended up being Mockingbird, Tigra, Wonder Man, and Hawkeye, plus, you guessed it, Iron Man. Well, in this case it was actually Rhodey wearing the mask, but this is Hawkeye just trying to keep an identity as a superhero, but also kind of being this Switzerland-like type character where he's never really picking sides. He didn't pick sides in the Civil War. He didn't really try and take over as a leader, but ends up getting himself put into that position on the West Coast. And then, it's this always kind of, he's always kind of second string to the rest of the team. But ultimately what happens is what we see in the movies where despite being this kind of second string hanger-on, he also ends up being this centerpiece for the group, for them to all rally around. When everything gets to be too much, they can really count on Hawkeye to be there and kind of be their sounding board for what a normal life can look like. So, not my favorite character, ultimately kind of a throwaway in the MCU as well. The Disney Plus show was actually kind of decent, but ultimately we have the same sort of problem where it's hard to root for just a normal dude when everybody else has superpowers. So let's move on to the Endo-Sim armor. Alright, stop me if you heard this one. The superhero du jour is brainwashed, and ultimately their brain is taken over by some other force that mind controls them and uses them for nefarious purposes. I think we've probably heard that thread a few times, right? Well, that's what we're dealing with here with the Endo-Sim armor. So Tony was taken over mentally by Scarlet Witch and manipulated. We kind of see a little bit of that in the movies, but this is that to the nth degree. So now we're combining with the powers of Extremis, plus Scarlet Witch's influence, plus Tony having a lot of different influences in his brain, now we all of a sudden have this endosym armor, which is almost a symbiote style armor that Tony has kind of, I don't know, embodied, if you will. And what this does is it embraces his most egotistical, sadistic self, and combined with Extremis makes him extraordinarily dangerous. So much like Spider-Man's symbiote, this is definitely something that is going to make him his worst self. So in this armor, he's able to withstand just about any kind of attack, and is just completely, let's just call it what it is. He's just an ass. So this is, again, I think it's the developers of Tony's various plot lines just going, okay, let's take the kind of stuff that we've written so far to the nth degree and see where it goes. So this symbiote is almost a nod to Spider-Man, if you will. So let's go ahead and set this aside. We do have one more book, and it is the base. I didn't pull that out and set it on the desk because it is rather large, so I'll do that now. We're going to get that last piece, or I should say the next piece, which is piece number 4, onto the base and thread it in. I said piece number 4. Piece number 2, wired in and ready to go for the light when we ultimately get all the pieces together and set up for it to light up for the base. So let me go ahead and pull all that out and we'll get started. You might recall that we went ahead and wired this for lights already. We wired up the button here and got that locked down, and then we're going to have lights that plug into these sockets. But in the meantime, we need to put another piece down on this overall assembly. It does give you a sense of scale though. You can see how big this is really going to be, which I don't know about you, but I'm excited. So that's just going to sit there. I mean, you can't mess that up. And we're going to pull these screws out and start getting them loaded. First up are the HM screws. This reflector piece just drops in, and we've got 4 screws to lock down here. As always, they've given us extras, so don't think I'm missing one if I don't get 5 screws in. There's only 4 spots. Next, we use the IM screws to connect this to the next segment. We'll also be joining these together. Let's make sure that that lines up correctly, which it does. Don't recommend tightening these down completely until you've gotten all of the screws in, just to make sure everything lines up correctly. So I'm going to get these mostly started, and then I'll go back and hit them all, make sure that they're nice and tight. Generally speaking, that's how you want to get these larger assemblies together. You want to make sure that you're not over tightening them until you are sure that everything's in place. Which it seems like everything's aligned, so I'm going to go ahead and lock this one down, and then I'm going to cycle back through them and get them all locked down. as I said I would do just a minute ago. And just like that, we've got that next assembly piece looking good, looking real good. Awesome. And that does it for this episode. Thank you very much for joining me. I sincerely appreciate it, and thank you so much for your patience for me getting this all back on track. I appreciate all of your kind words and all the messages and emails that you sent me. That means so much to me. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. So I'm Ron Burke, editor-in-chief for GamingTrend.com. It will be a very short span before we do our next one, so stay tuned. I'll be right back.